So guided by shared values and principles, Canada and its G7 partners recognize the importance of working together to build a more peaceful, prosperous, and sustainable world. The G7 strongly support a rules-based international order built around the core principles of democracy, human rights, the rule of law, territorial integrity, and an aspiration to free and open trade that benefits all citizens, not just the wealthiest few. So this is to me, this is one of those beautiful topics. Sarah Jean, your hand's up in Japan right away, because I think you'll have a good perspective on this. So I'd love to hear all of your thoughts around, this is truly the safe and security topic. Sarah Jean, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I think maybe this isn't so much Japanese government policy. However, I think that as G7 nations, we need to stand together and accept the fact that whether it's peacekeeping forces, whether it is peace negotiations, peace mediation and conflict resolution, and then most importantly, peace building systems or processes are not inclusive, despite the fact that research shows, data shows the need to include different voices at the table for peace building, for peace to actually be lasting and sustainable, and that reoccurring conflict is the major problem we have. And one of the issues is voices are not heard. And it's not just women's, it's not just persons with disabilities, it's not just Indigenous peoples, it's having all voices heard. And that's the only way we build peace. And that's the key thing in peace mediation. I've been studying conflict mediation the last 2 years, and the key point is people being heard. And G7 countries, I understand for political reasons, do not necessarily want all voices heard, but being in a really delicate area here now in Northeast Asia, it's really important people talk and listen to each other. Is more important than the talking, is actually the listening. And different voices, different perspectives, whether we like them or not, have got to be heard. And sometimes we have to force ourselves to speak up.
All right. Well, on that note, Sarah G made some great points. Carolina from Canada, what do you think about that?
We've created an industry of war. It's point blank what it is. It's an economy. And until we recognize that we've created this and it generates jobs, so we need to look at peace from an economic perspective as well. What are the economies that can be created that are peaceful economies? And those are economies that are attached to environmental practices. They're attached to the arts. Essentially, people need to work. They need to have jobs. They need to be working towards something. War is not one of them. We have to stop trying to invade countries, and we have to stop trying to conquer things and nurture, our relationships around the globe now with the technologies that we have. So until we de-weaponize, and I understand that peacekeeping is important, but truthfully, we're still using war as a pretext to invade countries so that we can get their natural resources. And until we start talking about that openly and point blank, and with men at the table only at the G7, I'm not sure they continue to play with those games. And these games are destroying families, they're destroying women, they're destroying natural resources, they're destroying land. And when you destroy land, you have a massive exodus of people moving from where they no longer can live and build a life and thrive into countries that started that because they wanted their natural resources. So it's a vicious cycle. And until we understand relationships at a micro and macro level, I don't think we can truly create peace in this planet, because peace comes from allowing people to be, nurture. And so we need to create economies that reflect that peace ultimately.
Thank you. I'm going to go from Carolina to Carolyn in Germany.
I totally agree with that, because the main reason for the EU, or why the European Union actually evolved, was this idea behind it was to say that, okay, if all the countries are connected through the economies, war is not possible anymore, because it would be terrible for all countries. And I think we need to expand this idea on a worldwide level to make sure that war is not possible anymore. And I think Germany has a very big role to play in this, because as one of the 3 biggest weapon exporters, like, it is shameful, I think, for Germany, and then that Germany is responsible for ongoing violent conflicts. And many of you just mentioned before, most of the time the source of wars is resources, access to resources. When you look at Syria, that's what it's all about in the end. It's about access to resources, access to oil and energy in the end. So I think in order to make sure that we have a more peaceful world, we need to stop exporting weapons, and we need to make sure that we have this shift to renewable energies, to make sure that we cannot, we do not fight about current resources or finite resources of energy.
Thank you. Excellent point. I'm thinking, Jessica, would you like to jump in?
Yes, actually. Okay, so specifically talking about situations with peace, I would just like to take this opportunity to speak about Palestine, which is in the news a lot right now, and the Gaza Strips, specifically the human rights violations that are happening there, and how they are motivated not by an actual conflict, but by what the West has to gain from the situation between Palestine and Israel. So I think that G7, that is one specific thing that they need to address there. And then on a general level, talking about the education of international laws and violations, and how we as a global community need to implement sticking to international laws and violations. And when you create destabilization in these countries, then you create mass exodus, a migrant and refugee problem, these crises of which women specifically are at risk for, because then they need to take themselves and their entire families, and usually if the male partner, they are killed fighting. So they're on their own with their children, trying to cross long. Since here in Italy, we have a huge problem where there are actual rescue teams saving people from the Mediterranean Sea that are drowning in these tiny tin migrant boats. So the EU now has been taken to help financially support this cause and to reposition the people in the world. And a lot of countries are closing their doors to them, saying, we don't have the finances to support you. Okay, so don't destabilize their country in the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. One of the G7 countries missing on this call is the USA. I'll definitely Germany. I think Angela Merkel was a shining light during the Syrian refugee crisis. And I think many of the other leaders, followed her lead. And so I think that's important to point out. But it's still a growing problem across this country. It's heartbreaking. Yeah, and it just doesn't seem like we've got a proper solution. What I was thinking about doing here is, Honorine, I know you're more comfortable speaking in French, so perhaps you could give your point, and then I'll go to Esther, you can translate, and then Esther, you can bring up your point. Would that work? Okay, that sounds good. Okay, please go ahead, Honorine.
Alors moi, pour tout ce qui concerne donc les violences et la violence en général, je pense qu'il y a un vrai problème au niveau déjà de tout ce qui est préjugé et la communication et aussi comprendre les besoins des autres et des gens, parce que il y a toujours une sorte de prétexte que les gens essayent d'utiliser sur les autres et la vision des autres qu'ils ont, qui est très xénophobe. Et donc, c'est toujours une sorte de prétexte à utiliser la violence, à être violent avec les autres. Et c'est ce qu'on voit, par exemple, avec ce qui s'est passé avec le rejet des migrants dans les Alpes, il me semble. Et c'était une bonne façon, alors qu'en soi, des personnes qui ont utilisé la violence, qui ont utilisé la violence et qui ont expulsé ces migrants, ils n'avaient pas le droit de le faire. C'est pas des gens qui sont payés par l'État. Ils n'ont aucun lien avec l'État. Donc, en soi, ils n'ont pas le droit de le faire. Pourtant, l'État n'a rien dit. Alors que pour moi, je pense en tout cas que c'est illégal déjà d'agir comme ça parce qu'ils ont demandé à personne. Enfin, le pays leur appartient pas. Et donc, il y a, un vrai problème, je pense, sur la communication et sur l'entente avec l'autre et les besoins des autres parce que si jamais en fait le cas était inversé, on aimerait bien pouvoir être accueilli chez quelqu'un d'autre et on n'aimerait pas forcément être traité de la même façon que les migrants sont, avec autant de violence et autant de rejet et de xénophobie. Donc, je pense que déjà, c'est aussi un problème de communication, d'entente, de compréhension et aussi de beaucoup de peur, en fait. C'est surtout une façon de montrer qu'on a peur et qu'on ne veut pas être plus tolérant avec l'autre. Donc, c'est un problème qui est très récurrent en ce moment, en tout cas en France. La violence, on la sent, elle est là, elle est présente. Pour plein de choses, pas seulement pour les migrants, mais aussi pour les communautés minoritaires comme les LGBT. Enfin, il y a les statistiques ont montré que la violence envers les personnes LGBT, elle avait monté de 15%. Enfin, il y a un vrai problème de violence en France et pourtant, on le sait, mais personne ne fait rien. On dit juste, ah, bah, ça, c'est pas grave. Enfin, il y a quelque chose de malsain. Voilà.
Thank you, Honorine. Esther, we're going to go to you for a translation. And then when you're finished with that, I'd love to hear your thoughts, your personal thoughts around this issue.
Thank you. So what Honorine said was that, especially in France, we have like this huge problem with stereotypes, and we don't understand the needs of others, and so we tend like to mingle and like to completely put everything in like the same like bowl, for example, and like so she said like violence has become like kind of a pretext, like how do you say in English, like an excuse, like to exclude the other. And it can be either like the LGBTQA plus community, but also the migrants, asylum seekers, and minorities, racial, gender, etc., sexual minorities. And she also said that she took the example of what happened in the Alps a few weeks ago, and where like an extremist group from the far right group, like completely blocked migrants who were crossing the border in the Alps, and it was extremely violent because of how they communicated their action. They were like with flags, etc. It was like huge thing, etc. And what Honorine said is like one of the main problem in France is that we don't have like a real response from the government about this violence, which is constant, and about the xenophobia, etc. And one of the reasons, she said, is maybe the fear, because we have this huge problem. Well, this is my personal opinion, but it goes with Honorine. Like, I think like we have this huge problem, like with like concepts and like words, like for example race, xenophobia, etc. We don't talk about it because it's so like sensible for regarding French history and blah blah blah. And so this is a huge problem in order to tackle violence. So yeah, and Honorine finished by saying how we need like to think differently and like and to start in order to accept the other. And on that, I would add that activism, and especially feminist activism, has a huge work to do on rethinking borders, I think, and either in academia, but also in media, etc., like talking about borders and rethink them, etc., in order to connect everyone, because like this is like one of the main plan of the feminist community, is to connect it, to include everyone. And so I do think that there is an urgency like to rethink borders, and it goes like to the first question about new technologies and how we use them and how they can be like a great tool in order like to rethink the local and the global and the borders and to include everyone and like to democratize kind of like concepts, etc., in order like as Honorine said, to tackle violence, because we don't necessarily talk about it like yeah.
Thank you. No, I think that's a great point. And Uma, let's go to you. Can you sum this up for us? You've done such a good job on the past with the big conclusion, so please.
I think there's a couple of things here that I will just say to sum up in terms of building a more peaceful and secure world. Most of the countries that are on this call or represented on this call for the G7 panel have a history of colonization, and we cannot ignore that history if we are to address how to build a more peaceful world in the now and in the future, because a lot of how we approach these policies and how we approach these issues is still very much from that colonizing mindset, right? So one of the key questions within this this issue, is what can the G7 do to uphold international order and respect for international law? I would argue, are the G7 countries themselves doing that? Are they themselves upholding international law and respecting international order? I mean, we've just seen the United States pull out of the Iran nuclear deal, which is a very, very, very important piece of treaty that will allow stabilization to happen in the Middle East, which is so needed. And it's decisions like this made by people that really ignore the stability that others are really trying to work for within this world. And as has been said in this topic already, in terms of gender equality and in terms of diversity, in terms of peace, women are the bearers of peace. We see this time and time again. When women hold this space for these discussions to happen, we hold this space for disagreements to happen, but also growth to happen in a very loving and open way. Most of the wars that have started in this world have been started by men. Most of the push for peace that has happened in the world has happened because of women. And we cannot forget this. If we are to move forward in a peaceful world, it is women that need to lead the way. Women led the way in terms of the nuclear treaty that has now been signed by a majority of countries, with the work of ICANN and Reaching Critical Will and WILF. It was women that made that happen, along with the help of men, but it was women that pushed for that, and Japan was a major player in this. So I really do think that we really need to remember our history, but then it is women that really need to push men to do better and be better, and then push for peace in that way.
Thanks, Duma. And I think, as always, we come back to the fact that if our voices aren't being heard and we're not being listened to, I should just say the world will be a better place when 50% of people making decisions are female. Period. Drop the mic. Thank you, ladies, all of you. Early Saturday morning talk. We dove into some biggies. Well, at least it wasn't Canada. I think it's afternoon for you and night in Germany. So thank you all for taking time and making the space to have this conversation. I think it's really interesting, and I think that people will be interested in all of your different perspectives. So I really appreciate it. So thank you.